Chapter 1 Menzoberranzan. To a surface dweller he may have passed undetected only a foot away. The padded footfalls of his lizard mount were too light to be heard, and the pliable and perfectly crafted mesh armor that both rider and mount wore bent and creased with their movements, as well as if the suits had grown over their skin. Dinin's lizard trotted along in an easy but swift gait, floating over the broken floor, up the walls, and even across the long tunnel's ceiling. Subterranean lizards, with their sticky and soft three-toed feet, were preferred mounts for just this ability, to scale stone as easily as a spider. Crossing hard ground left no damning tracks in the lighted surface world, but nearly all of the creatures of the Underdark possessed infravision, the ability to see in the infrared spectrum. Footfalls left heat residues that could easily be tracked if they followed a predictable course along a corridor's floor. Dinin clamped tight to his saddle as the lizard plodded along a stretch of the ceiling, then sprang out in a twisting descent to a point further along the wall. Dinin did not want to be tracked. He had no light to guide him, but he needed none. He was a dark elf, a drow, an ebony-skinned cousin of those sylvan folk who danced under the stars on the world's surface. To Dinin's superior eyes, which translated subtle variations of heat into vivid and colorful images, the Underdark was far from a lightless place. Colors all across the spectrum swirled before him in the stone of the walls and the floor, heated by some distant fixture or hot stream. The heat of living things was most distinctive, letting the dark elf view his enemies in details as intricate as any surface dweller would find in brilliant daylight. Normally, Dinin would not have left the city alone. The world of the Underdark was too dangerous for solo treks, even for a drow elf. This was different, though. Dinin had to be certain that no unfriendly drow eyes marked his passage. A soft blue magical glow beyond a sculptured archway told the drow that he had neared the city's entrance, and he slowed the lizard's pace accordingly. Few used this narrow tunnel, which opened into Tir Breach, the northern section of Menzoberranzan devoted to the academy, and none but the mistresses and masters, the instructors of the academy, could pass through here without attracting suspicion. Dinin was always nervous when he came to this point. Of the 100 tunnels that opened off the main cavern of Menzoberranzan, this one was best guarded. Beyond the archway, twin statues of gigantic spiders sat in quiet defense. If an enemy crossed through, the spiders would animate and attack, and alarms would be sounded all throughout the academy. Dinin dismounted, leaving his lizard clinging comfortably to the wall at his chest level. He reached under the collar of his pawafwai, his magical shielding cloak, and took out his neck purse. From this, Dinin produced the insignia of House Doerden, a spider wielding various weapons in each of its 8 legs, and emblazoned with the letters D-N for Deamon Neshes Beanon, the ancient and formal name of House Doerden. "You will await my return," Dinin whispered as he waved the insignia before it. As with all drow houses, the insignia of House Doerden held several magical duumers, one of which gave the family members absolute control over house pets. The lizard would obey unfailingly, holding its position as though it were rooted in stone, even if a scurry rat, its favorite morso, napped a few feet from its maw. Dinin took a deep breath and gingerly stepped to the archway. He could see the spiders leering down at him from their 15-foot height. He was a drow of the city, not an enemy, and could pass through any other tunnel unconcerned. But the academy was an unpredictable place. Dinin had heard that the spiders often refused entry, viciously even to uninvited drow. He could not be delayed by fears and possibilities, Dinin reminded himself. His business was of the utmost importance to his family's battle plans. Looking straight ahead, away from the towering spiders, he strode between them and onto the floor of Tir Breach. He moved to the side and paused, first to be certain that no one lurked nearby, and then to admire the sweeping view of Menzoberranzan. No one, drow or otherwise, had ever looked out from this spot without a sense of wonder at the Drow city. Tir Breach was the highest point on the floor of the 2-mile cavern, affording a panoramic view to the rest of Menzoberranzan. The cubby of the academy was narrow, holding only 3 structures that comprised the Drow school. Arak Tanilith, the spider-shaped school of Loth. Sorcery, the graceful curving main-spired tower of wizardry. And Melee Magther, the somewhat plain pyramid structure where male fighters learn their trade. Beyond Tir Breach, through the ornate stalagmite columns that mark the entrance to the academy, the cavern dropped away quickly and spread wide, going far beyond Dinin's line of vision to either side and further back than his keen eyes could possibly see. The colors of Menzoberranzan were threefold to the sensitive eyes of the Drow. Heat patterns from various fixtures and hot springs swirled about the entire cavern. Purple and red, bright yellow and subtle blue, crossed and merged, climbed the walls in stalagmite mounds, or ran off singularly in cutting lines against the backdrop of dim grey stone. More confined than these generalized and natural gradations of color in the infrared spectrum were the regions of intense magic, like the spiders Dinin had walked between, virtually glowing with energy. Finally, there were actual lights of the city. Fairy fire and highlighted sculptures on the houses. The Drow were proud of the beauty of their designs, and especially ornate columns or perfectly crafted gargoyles were almost always limned in permanent magical lights. Even from the distance, Dinin could make out House Bainry, the first house of Menzoberranzan. It encompassed 20 stalagmite pillars and half again that number of gigantic stalactites. House Bainry had existed for 5,000 years since the founding of Menzoberranzan, and in that time the work to perfect the house's art had never ceased. Practically every inch of the immense structure glowed in fairy fire, blue at the outlying towers and brilliant purple at the huge central dome. The sharp light of candles, foreign to the Underdark, glared through some of the windows of distant houses. Only clerics or wizards would light fires, Dinin knew, as necessary pains in their world of scrolls and parchments. This was Menzoberranzan, the city of Drow. 20,000 dark elves lived there, 20,000 soldiers in the army of evil. A wicked smile spread across Dinin's lips when he thought of some of those soldiers who would fall this night. Dinin studied Nabondal, the huge central pillar that served as the time clock of Menzoberranzan. Nabondal was the only way the Drow elf had to mark the passage of time in a world that otherwise knew no day and no seasons. At the end of each day, the city's appointed archmage cast his magical fires into the base of the stone pillar. There, the spell lingered throughout the cycle, a full day on the surface, and gradually spread its warmth up the structure of Nabondal, until the whole of it glowed red in the infrared spectrum. The pillar was fully dark now, cooled since the Dumer's fires had expired. The wizard was even now at the base, Dinin reasoned, ready to begin the cycle anew. It was midnight, the appointed hour. Dinin moved away from the spiders and the tunnel exit and crept along the side of Tir Breach, seeking the shadows of heat patterns in the wall, which would effectively hide the distinct outline of his own body temperatures. He came at last to Sorcery, the school of wizardry, and slipped into the narrow alleyway between the tower's curving base and Tir Breach's outer wall.
"Student or master?"
came the extended whisper.
"Only a master may walk out of house in Tir Breach in the Black Death of Nabondal,"
Dinin responded. A heavily robed figure moved around the arc of the structure to stand before Dinin. The stranger remained in the customary posture of a master of the Drow Academy, his arms out before him and bent at the elbows, his hands tight together, one on top of the other in front of his chest. That pose was the only thing about this one that seemed normal to Dinin. "Greetings, faceless one," he signaled in the silent hand code of the Drow, a language as detailed as the spoken word. The quiver in Dinin's hands belied his calm face, though, for the sight of this wizard put him as far on edge of his nerves as he had ever been.
Second boy Duerden,
the wizard replied in the gestured code.
have you my payment?
You will be compensated, Dinan signaled pointedly, regaining his composure in the first swelling bubbles of his temper. Do you dare doubt the promise of Malice Duerden, matron mother of Deamon Neshes Beanon, 10th house of Menzoberranzan? The faceless one slumped back, knowing he had erred.
My apologies, second boy of House Duerden,
he answered, dropping to one knee in a gesture of surrender. Since he entered this conspiracy, the wizard had feared that his impatience might cost him his life. He had been caught in the violent throes of one of his own magical experiments, the tragedy melting away all of his facial features and leaving behind a blank hot spot of white and green goo. Matron Malice Duerden, reputedly as skilled as anyone in all the vast city in mixing potions and salves, had offered him a sliver of hope that he could not pass by. No pity found its way into Dinan's calloused heart, but House Duerden needed the wizard. You will get your salve, Dinan promised calmly, when Alton de Vere is dead.
Of course,
the wizard agreed.
This night.
Dinan crossed his arms and considered the question. Matron Malice had instructed him that Alton de Vere should die even as their family's battle commenced. That scenario now seemed too clean, too easy to Dinan. The faceless one did not miss the sparkle that suddenly brightened the scarlet glow in the young Duerden's heat-sensing eyes. Wait for Nalbondo's light to approach its zenith, Dinan replied, his hands working through the signals excitedly, and his grimace seeming more of a twisted grin.
Should the doomed boy know his house's fate before he dies?
The wizard asked, guessing at the wicked intentions behind Dinan's instructions. As the killing blow falls, answered Dinan, let Alton de Vere die without hope. Dinan retrieved his mount and sped off down the empty corridors, finding an intersecting route that would take him in through a different entrance to the city proper. He came in along the eastern end of the great cavern, Menzoberranzan's produce section, where no drow families would see that he had been outside the city limits, and where only a few unremarkable stalagmite pillars rose up from the flat stone. Dinan spurred his mount along the banks of Donegarten, the city's small pond with its moss-covered island that housed a fair-sized herd of cattle-like creatures called Rothy. 100 goblins and orcs looked up from the herding and fishing duties to mark the drow soldiers' swift passage. Knowing their restrictions as slaves, they took care not to look Dinan in the eye. Dinan would have paid them no heed anyway. He was too consumed by the urgency of the moment. He kicked his lizard to even greater speeds when he again was on the flat and curving avenues between the glowing drow castles. He moved toward the south-central region of the city, toward the giant grove of mushrooms that marked the section of the finest houses in Menzoberranzan. As he came around one blind turn, he nearly ran over a group of 4 wandering bugbears. The giant hairy goblin things paused a moment to consider the drow, then moved slowly and purposefully out of his way. The bugbears recognized him as a member of House Duerden, Dinan knew. He was a noble, a son of a high priestess, and his surname, Duerden, was the name of his house. Of the 20,000 dark elves in Menzoberranzan, only 1,000 or so were nobles, actually the children of the 67 recognized families of the city. The rest were common soldiers. Bugbears were not stupid creatures. They knew a noble from a commoner, and though drow elves did not carry their family insignia in plain view, the pointed and tailed cut of Dinan's stark white hair, and the distinctive pattern of purple and red lines in his black pawafwi told them well enough who he was. The mission's urgency pressed upon Dinan, but he could not ignore the bugbear's slight. How fast would they have scampered away if he had been a member of House Bainry, or one of the other 7 ruling houses, he wondered. You will learn respect of House Duerden soon enough, the dark elf whispered under his breath, as he turned and charged his lizard at the group. The bugbears broke into a run, turning down an alley strewn with stones and debris. Dinan found his satisfaction by calling on the innate powers of his race. He summoned a globe of darkness, impervious to both infravision and normal sight in the fleeing creature's path. He supposed it was unwise to call such attention to himself, but a moment later, when he heard the crashing and sputtering curses as the bugbears stumbled blindly over the stones, He felt it was worth the risk. His anger sated, he moved off again, picking a more careful route through the heat shadows. As a member of the 10th house of the city, Dinin can go as he pleased within the great cavern without question. But Matron Malice had made it clear that no one connected to House Duerden was to be caught anywhere near the Mushroom Grove. Matron Malice, Dinin's mother, was not to be crossed. But it was only a rule. After all, in Menzoberranzan, one rule took precede over all the petty others. Don't get caught. At the Mushroom Grove's southern end, the impetuous drow found what he was looking for. A cluster of 5 huge floor-to-ceiling pillars that were hollowed into a network of chambers and connected with metal and stone parapets and bridges. Red glowing gargoyles, the standard of the house, glared down from 100 perches like silent sentries. This was House de Vere, 4th house of Menzoberranzan. A stockade of tall mushrooms ringed the place, every 5th one a shrieker, a sentient fungus named and favored as guardians for the shrill cries of alarm it emitted whenever living beings passed it by. Dinin kept a cautious distance, not wanting to set off one of the shriekers, and knowing also that other, more deadly wards protected the fortress. Matron Malice would see to those. An expected hush permeated the air of this city section. It was general knowledge throughout Menzoberranzan that Matron Guinevere of House de Vere had fallen out of favour with Loth, the Spider Queen deity to all drow and the true source of every house's strength. Such circumstances were never openly discussed among the drow, but everyone who knew fully expected that some family lower in the city hierarchy soon would strike out against the crippled House de Vere. Matron Guinevere and her family had been the last to learn of the Spider Queen's displeasure. Ever was that Loth's devious way, and Dinin could tell just by scanning the outside of House de Vere that the doomed family had not found ample time to erect proper defences. De Vere sported nearly 400 soldiers, many female, but those that Dinin could now see at their post along the parapets seemed nervous and unsure. Dinin's smile spread even wider when he thought of his own house, which grew in power daily under the cunning guidance of Matron Malice. With all 3 sisters rapidly approaching the status of High Priestess, his brother an accomplished wizard, and his uncle Zaknafane, the finest weapons master in all of Menzoberranzan, busily training the 300 soldiers, House Duerden was a complete force. And Matron Malice, unlike Guinevere, was in the Spider Queen's full favour. Deamon ne chez Beanon, Dinin muttered under his breath, using the formal and ancestral reference to House Duerden, 9th house of Menzoberranzan. He liked the sound of it. Halfway across the city, beyond the silver-glowing balcony and the arched doorway 20 feet up the cavern's west wall, sat the principals of House Duerden, gathered to outline the final plans of the night's work. On the raised dais at the back of the small audience chamber sat vulnerable Matron Malice, her belly swollen in the final hours of pregnancy. Flanking her in their places of honor were her 3 daughters, Maya, Verna, and the eldest, Briza, a newly ordained priestess of Loth. Maya and Verna appeared as younger versions of their mother, slender and deceptively small, though possessing great strength. Briza, though, hardly carried the family resemblance. She was big, huge by drow standards, and rounded in the shoulders and hips. Those who knew Briza well figured that her size was merely a circumstance of her temperament. A smaller body could not have contained the anger and brutal streak of House Duerden's newest high priestess.
"Dinin should return soon,"
remarked Risen, the present patron of the family,
"to let us know if it's time for the assault."
"We go before Nobondo finds its morning glow," Briza snapped at him in her thick but razor-sharp voice. She turned a crooked smile to her mother, seeking approval for putting the male in his place. "The child comes this night," Matron Malice explained to her anxious husband. "We go no matter what news Dinin bears." "It will be a boy child," groaned Briza, making no effort to hide her disappointment. "3rd living son of House Duerden." "To be sacrificed to Loth," put in Zaknafane, a former patron of the house, who now held an important position of weapon master. The skilled drow fighter seemed quite pleased at the thought of the sacrifice, as did Nalfane, the family's eldest son, who stood at Zack's side. Nalfane was elder boy, and he needed no more competition beyond Dinin within the ranks of House Duerden. In accordance to custom, Brizza glowered, and the red of her eyes brightened. To aid in our victory. Risen shifted uncomfortably. Matron Malice, he dared speak. You know well of the difficulties of birthing. Might the pain distract you? You dare question the matron mother? Brizza started sharply, reaching for the snake-headed whip so comfortably strapped and writhing on her belt. Matron Malice stopped her with an outstretched hand. Attend to the fighting, Matron Malice said to Risen. Let the females of the house see to the important matters of this battle. Risen shifted again and dropped his gaze. Dinin came to the magically wrought fence that connected the keep within the city's west wall with the two small stalagmite towers of House Duerden, and which formed the courtyard to the compound. The fence was adamantite, the hardest metal in all the world, and adorning it were 100 weapon-wielding spider carvings, each ensorcelled with deadly glyphs and wards. The mighty gate of House Duerden was the envy of many a drow house, but so soon after viewing the spectacular houses in the mushroom grove, Dinin could only find disappointment when he looked upon his own abode. The compound was plain and somewhat bare, as was the section of the wall, with the notable exception of the mithril and adamantite balcony running along the second level, by the arched doorway reserved for the nobility of the family. Each baluster of the balcony supported 1,000 carvings, all of which blended into a single piece of art. House Duerden, unlike the great majority of the houses in Menzoberranzan, did not stand free within groves of stalactites and stalagmites. The bulk of the structure was within a cave, and while this setup was indisputably defensible, Dinin found himself wishing that his family could show a bit more grandeur. An excited soldier rushed to the open gate for the returning second boy. Dinin swept past him without so much as a word of greeting and moved across the courtyard, conscious of the 100 and more curious glances that fell upon him. The soldiers and slaves knew that Dinin's mission this night had something to do with the anticipated battle. No stairway led to the silvery balcony of House Duerden's second level. This, too, was a precautionary measure designed to segregate the leaders of the house from the rabble and the slaves. Drow nobles needed no stairs. Another manifestation of their innate magical abilities allowed them the power of levitation. With hardly a conscious thought to the act, Dinin drifted easily through the air and dropped onto the balcony. He rushed through the archway and down the house's main central corridor, which was dimly lit in the soft hues of fairy fire, allowing for sight in the normal light spectrum, but not bright enough to defeat the use of infravision. The ornate brass door at the corridor's end marked the second boy's destination, and he paused before it and allowed his eyes to shift back into the infrared spectrum. Unlike the corridor, the room beyond this door had no light source. It was the audience hall of the High Priestesses, an anteroom to House Duerden's grand chapel. The drow clerical rooms, in accord with the dark rites of the Spider Queen, were not a place of light. When he felt prepared, Dinin pushed straight through the door, shoving past the two shocked female guards without hesitation, and moving boldly to stand before his mother. All three of the family sisters narrowed their eyes at their brash and pretentious brother. To enter without permission, he knew they were thinking, would that it was he who was to be sacrificed this night. As much as he enjoyed testing the limitations of his inferior station as a male, Dinin could not ignore the threatening glances of Verna, Maya, and Brizza. Dinin watched as the enchanted extensions of the clerics, the dreaded snake-headed whips on his sister's belt, began writhing in anticipation of the punishment they would enact. The handles were adamantite and ordinary enough, but the whips, lengths, and multiple heads were living serpents. Brizza's whip, in particular, a wicked 6-headed device, danced and squirmed, tying itself into knots around the belt that held it. Brizza was always the quickest to punish. Matron Malice, however, seemed pleased by Dinin's swagger. The second boy knew his place well enough by her measure, and he followed her commands fearlessly without question. Dinin took comfort in the calmness of his mother's face, quite the opposite of the shining white-hot faces of his three sisters. "All is ready," he said to her. "House de Vere huddles within its fence, except for Alton, of course, foolishly attending his studies in sorcery." "You have met with the Faceless One?" Matron Malice asked. "The Academy was quiet this night," Dinin replied. "Our meeting went off perfectly." "He has agreed to our contract?" "Alton de Vere will be dealt with accordingly," Dinin chuckled. He then remembered the slight altercation he had made in Matron Malice's plan, delaying Alton's execution for the sake of his own lust for added cruelty. Dinin's thought evoked another recollection as well. High priestesses of Loth had an unnerving talent for reading thoughts. "Alton de Vere will die this night," Dinin quickly completed the answer, assuring the others before they could probe him for more definite details.
Excellent,
Brizza growled. Dinin breathed a little easier. "To the meld," Matron Malice ordered. The 4 drow males moved to kneel before the matron and her daughters. Risen to Malice, Zacnafine to Brizza, Nalfane to Maya, and Dinin to Verna. The clerics chanted in unison, placing one hand delicately upon the forehead of their respective soldier, tuning into his passions. "You know your places," Matron Malice said when the ceremony was completed. She grimaced through the pain of another contraction. "Let our work begin." Less than an hour later, Zacnafine and Brizza stood together on the balcony outside the upper entrance of House Duerden. Below them, on the cavern floor, the 2nd and 3rd Brigades of the family army. Risen's and Nalfane's bustled about, fitting on heated leather straps and metal patches, camouflage against a distinctive elven form of heat-seeking drow eyes. Dinin's group, the initial strike force that included 100 goblin slaves, had long since departed. "We will be known after this night," Brizza said. "None would have suspected that a 10th house would dare move against one as powerful as de Vere. When whispers ripple out after the night's bloody work, even Bainry will take note of Deamon Nashez Bayanan." She leaned out over the balcony to watch as the 2 brigades formed into lines and started out silently, along separate paths that would bring them through the winding city to the Mushroom Grove and the 5-pillared structure of House de Vere. Zacnafine eyed the back of Matron Malice's eldest daughter, wanting nothing more than to put a dagger into the back of her spine. As always, though, good judgment kept Zac's practiced hand in its place. "Have you the articles?" Brizza inquired, showing Zac considerably more respect than she had when Matron Malice sat protectively at her side. Zac was only a male, a commoner allowed to don the family name as his own because he sometimes served Matron Malice in a husbandly manner and had once been the patron of the house. Still, Brizza feared to anger him. Zac was the weapon master of House Duerden, a tall and muscular male, stronger than most females, and those who had witnessed his fighting wrath considered him among the finest warriors of either sex in all of Menzoberranzan. Besides Brizza and her mother, both high priestesses of the Spider Queen, Zacnafine, with his unrivaled swordsmanship, was House Duerden's trump. Zac held up the black hood and opened a small pouch on his belt, revealing several tiny ceramic spheres. Brizza smiled evilly and rubbed her slender hands together. "Matron Malice will not be pleased," she whispered. Zac returned the smile and turned to view the departing soldiers. Nothing gave the weapon master more pleasure than killing drow elves, particularly clerics of Loth. "Prepare yourself," Brizza said after a few minutes. Zac shook his thick hair back from his face and stood rigid, eyes tightly closed. Brizza drew her wand slowly, beginning the chant that would activate the device. She tapped Zac on the shoulder, then the other, then held the wand motionless over his head. Zac felt the frosty sprinkles falling down on him, permeating his clothes and armor, even his flesh, until all of his possessions had cooled to a uniform temperature and hue. Zac hated the magical chill. It felt as he imagined death would feel. But he knew that under the influence of the wand's sprinkles he was, to the heat-sensing eyes of the creatures of the Underdark, as grey as common stone, unremarkable and undetectable. Zack opened his eyes and shuddered, flexing his fingers to be sure they could still perform the fine edge of his craft. He looked back to Brizza, already in the midst of a second spell, the summoning. This one would take a while, so Zack leaned back against the wall and considered again the pleasant, though dangerous, task before him. How thoughtful of Matron Malice to leave all of House de Vere's clerics to him. "It is done," Brizza announced after a few minutes. She led Zack's gaze upward, to the darkness beneath the unseen ceiling of the immense cavern. Zack spotted Brizza's handiwork, an approaching current of air, yellow-tinted and warmer than the normal air of the cavern. A living current of air, the creature, a conjuration from an elemental plane, swirled to hover just beyond the lip of the balcony, obediently awaiting its summoner's commands. Zack didn't hesitate. He leaped out into the thing's mist, letting it hold him suspended above the floor. Brizza offered him a final salute and motioned her servant away. "Good fighting," Brizza called out to Zack, though he was already invisible in the air above her. Zack chuckled at the irony of her words as the twisted city of Menzoberranzan rolled out below him. She wanted the clerics of House de Vere dead as surely as Zack did, but for very different reasons. All complications aside, Zack would have been happy just killing clerics of House de Werden. The weapon master took up one of the adamantite swords, a drow weapon magically crafted and unbelievably sharp, with the edge of killing Duermers. "Good fighting indeed," he whispered. If only Brizza knew. How good?